The night my husband raised his glass, the air felt heavy enough to break. His voice, cold and sure, cut through the laughter as he said, "Some women turn out great, others just waste space." For a moment, I heard nothing else, just the echo of years spent holding everything together. I smiled, steady and calm, and whispered inside, this would be the last time he ever tried to make me small. "Thank you so much for being here with me today. I truly appreciate it. And before I begin, I would love it if you write in the comments where you are watching from. My name is Gladys, and I live in Ohio, and tonight, I want to share a moment that changed the way I saw my life. Not in a loud, dramatic way, but in the quiet way. Truth sometimes shows up when you least expect it. I spent many years sitting at that table, listening, nodding, laughing when everyone else laughed, even when the joke was at my expense, because I believed that keeping the peace meant keeping my place. And for a long time I convinced myself that love was supposed to feel heavy like that. I thought silence meant strength. But I've come to learn that silence can sometimes be the first sign that a person is fading away inside their own home. When he spoke those words, it wasn't the first time he made me feel small, but it was the last time I would let him. I looked around that table and saw faces that had grown used to seeing me shrink. Faces that never thought I'd stand up and walk away. That night, something settled inside me, not like a firestorm, but like a quiet door closing softly behind me. A promise I made to myself, that I would never again let anyone treat me like I was taking up space I hadn't earned. I met him when I was still full of bright dreams and simple hopes, the kind that make you believe love can fix anything, and forever is something you can hold in your hands. Back then, he had a way of making me feel like the world was softer when he was near. He smiled easy, spoke gently, and made promises that sounded like they were carved in stone. I remember the way my heart used to race when he'd reach for my hand at church picnics, or when we'd dance in the kitchen after dinner with the radio humming in the background. I built my life around those moments, around him, around the family we planned to grow together, and I truly believed that was enough to keep us strong. As the years passed, life became less about love stories and more about keeping everything running, making sure bills were paid, meals were cooked, and the house never fell apart. I carried more than I ever said out loud. He'd walk through the door with a nod, sit at the table I set, eat the food I cooked, sleep in the bed I made. And for so long, I thought that was just how marriages aged, not with fire, but with quiet routines. I gave up pieces of myself one by one, trading my voice for peace, my dreams for stability, my laughter for calm. I didn't even notice how invisible I had become, how my opinion stopped mattering, how my name felt like it belonged to someone who no longer existed. He started making little jokes about me in front of other people, and at first, I laughed too, because I told myself it was harmless. But those jokes grew sharper. They dug in deeper, and each time, the people around the table laughed like it was all fine, like it didn't chip away at something real inside me. It wasn't just the words. It was the way no one ever looked at me after. The way they moved on like my feelings weren't worth a second thought. I told myself it was just his way. That I was being too sensitive. That good wives don't stir up trouble. But deep down, I knew something was shifting. I can still remember one particular night when he teased me about forgetting something at the store, and everyone at the table laughed like they had just heard the funniest thing in the world. I sat there, forcing a smile, while something inside me went quiet. That silence became familiar over the years. I wore it like a second skin, learning to live inside it. It became easier to keep everything tucked in than to speak up and be met with laughter instead of love. I kept hoping that maybe if I tried harder, if I stayed kind, if I held the house together tightly enough, something would change. But love that only flows one way becomes a weight. And after years of carrying it, I finally started to feel how heavy it truly was. The shift didn't happen in one big moment. It happened slowly, almost quietly, like water seeping through cracks you didn't notice until the floor starts to give beneath your feet. I began to see things more clearly, not because they changed, but because I finally stopped convincing myself that they were normal. He started cutting me off in conversations, answering questions meant for me, speaking over my voice like it didn't belong in the room at all. At dinners, he would correct me on the smallest things, make it sound like I couldn't keep up, and the people around us would just smile and let it happen, as if it were all a harmless routine. I sat through those moments, my hands folded in my lap, pretending not to feel the sting, but inside me, the walls I had built to keep myself quiet were starting to tremble. One evening we had family over. The table was full, the house smelled like roasted chicken and cinnamon bread, and while everyone was talking, he looked at me with that smug little smile he wore when he thought he was clever. He told a story about something I supposedly did wrong, twisting it just enough to make me look foolish, but not cruel enough for anyone to call him out. Laughter bubbled around the table like it was the most natural thing in the world, but it felt like a knife pressed against my chest. I sat there, watching my life play out like I was just a background piece in a home I had built. That was the night I stopped hearing laughter as laughter. It started sounding like a wall closing in. It wasn't just the teasing, it was the way he made decisions without ever asking me. Trips planned without my input, big choices made as if I was just someone who happened to live in the same house, not a woman who had given him decades of her life. I noticed how he would talk about me like I wasn't in the room, like I was something to be described, not someone to be respected. And every time I opened my mouth to speak, he'd either talk louder or tilt his head like what I had to say didn't matter anyway. I would lie in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, asking myself when I disappeared. I could still feel the weight of the woman I used to be, the one who dreamed, laughed, and mattered. But it was like she was standing behind a locked door, waiting for me to find the key. The worst part was how familiar it had all become. I didn't even realize how far away from myself I had drifted. I stopped wearing colors I loved because he'd make comments about how loud they were. I stopped telling stories because he'd always finish them for me. I stopped laughing freely because every time I did, it felt like I was giving him another chance to make me small. That quiet erasing of a person doesn't happen overnight. It creeps in gently, and by the time you notice, you're already sitting in the corner of your own life, watching someone else hold the pen to your story. I told myself it was love, I told myself it was just his way, but deep down I knew love doesn't make you disappear. There was a night when the truth stopped whispering, and finally spoke to me so loud I couldn't pretend not to hear it anymore. It was one of those family dinners that I used to put my whole heart into, the kind where I set the table just right, folded the napkins, made sure everyone's favorite dishes were warm and waiting. I had spent the entire day cooking, moving through the kitchen like I always did, trying to keep everything perfect, even though somewhere inside me I already knew perfect wasn't enough for him. The house was full, the air heavy with the smell of rosemary chicken and baked apples, laughter floating through the rooms. But it was the kind of laughter that didn't reach me anymore. Not really. It felt distant, like it belonged to a world I no longer fit in. I stood at the counter, listening to their voices, waiting for him to say something kind, something that would make all those quiet hurts feel smaller. Instead, he began one of his stories. The kind where I was always the punchline. The kind where he would twist something ordinary I'd done and make it sound ridiculous. He told it with that careless grin, that tone that made him sound like a man who had earned the right to laugh at me. And they all laughed with him, even the ones who used to look at me with kindness. I could feel my heart beating slower, as if it was tired of carrying the same pain over and over again. In that moment, I didn't say a word, but something inside me cracked open. I thought of the woman I had been, standing next to him when he had nothing, building a home from almost nothing, raising our children when he was too busy with his own pride to notice the weight I carried alone. I thought of the nights I stayed up fixing what he broke, both in the house and in our lives, and how all of it somehow turned into a story he could turn against me with a smile on his face. He was no longer just teasing. He was building a stage where I was the fool and he was the one who got the applause. I stared at him while the laughter filled the room, and for the first time I saw him clearly. Not the man I fell in love with, not the man I built a life with, but the man who had learned to grow bigger by making me smaller. It wasn't a sudden betrayal. It was years of little cuts that had turned into one deep wound. I realized I had spent years defending him in silence, forgiving him without being asked, holding everything together while he slowly erased me. And I think the cruelest part was that he didn't even see it. Because in his mind, I was never meant to be more than the quiet woman at the edge of the table. That night, as I sat there watching his mouth curve into that familiar grin, something shifted forever. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't break the plates, I didn't storm out, but inside I started packing. I packed away the pieces of myself I had allowed him to step on. I packed away the love I had wasted on a man who no longer deserved it. And I promised myself that one day, when the moment came, I wouldn't just leave the table, I would leave the whole room. And when I did, I wouldn't look back. Not long after that night, I found myself sitting on the porch in the quiet of the early morning, holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. The house was still. The kind of stillness that only comes when everyone else is sleeping. But my mind was loud. I thought about how many years I had spent waiting for something to change, for someone to see me, for him to finally remember the woman I used to be. But as I sat there, I realized no one was coming to save me, and no miracle was going to fix a life that had already bent too far. What I needed wasn't a rescue, it was a choice. It was in that quiet moment that my granddaughter, Lily, stepped outside. She didn't say much at first, she just sat next to me, tucking her knees up like she always did when she was worried. She looked at me in a way no one else had in a long time. Really looked like she could see the sadness I had learned to hide behind a steady smile. She placed her hand on mine, and in a soft voice she said, "Grandma, you don't deserve this." Those words didn't sound like pity, they sounded like truth. And sometimes it only takes one honest sentence to make all the noise inside settle into something clear. That night, I had promised myself I would leave. But that morning, I began to believe it. Lily didn't try to fix me. She didn't tell me to stay strong or fight harder. She simply reminded me of something I had forgotten. That I was still a person, still worthy of being loved without being made small. Her words gave me the courage to let go of the idea of saving something that had already crumbled. And in that still air, with her hand holding mine, I felt the first spark of strength return to me. It wasn't loud, it wasn't grand, but it was real. It was the kind of strength that grows quietly, waiting for its moment to rise. After that morning with Lily, something inside me finally stopped waiting for permission to choose myself. For years, I had lived as though my life belonged to everyone else but me. But that quiet moment planted something steady inside my chest. I began to make small moves, careful steps that no one else could see. When he went on about his day, I started gathering what belonged to me, little by little, like a woman who was no longer unsure of her next step. I pulled out the old wooden box that had been sitting untouched in the back of my closet for years, the one holding the deed to my grandmother's cottage tucked between faded letters and yellowed photographs. That piece of land had always felt like a memory, but now it felt like a doorway. I spent evenings sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread out, signing my name on documents that would give me back the independence I had quietly let slip away. I opened an account in my name alone. The kind of thing I should have done long ago, but never dared to. I made calls when no one was around, spoke to people who helped me put everything in my hands, piece by piece. The world didn't know what I was doing, not even he did, because I carried it in silence, just like I had carried everything else. But this silence wasn't heavy. This silence was mine. Every step felt like taking a deep breath after years of holding it in. I planned carefully, booked a one-way flight to a place where no one would know me by the small version of myself he had built. I found movers who would pack and ship the things that mattered, leaving behind everything that was just noise and weight. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel trapped in his world. I was building my own. I didn't tell Lily every detail, but she saw the change in me. The way my shoulders no longer slumped under the weight of trying to hold a home that had long stopped being one. I didn't rush it. I didn't need to. I was finally walking toward a life that had been waiting patiently for me to claim it. The night everything came to the surface was quiet at first, the kind of quiet that sits just before a storm, even when no one else knows it's coming. The table was set just like it had been so many times before, plates shining, glasses raised, everyone gathered as if the weight of all those unspoken years wasn't sitting between us. He was in a good mood, or at least that's what he liked to call it when he had an audience. I sat across from him, calm, composed, but inside me everything was steady in a way it had never been before. I wasn't the woman who used to shrink when he spoke. I wasn't waiting for him to notice me or respect me. I was already gone, and he didn't even know it yet. I watched him laugh too loudly at his own stories, watched the faces around the table nod like they always did. They didn't see what was coming, but I did, because this dinner wasn't another night for me. This was my last. And then, with that same careless ease, he raised his glass, tilted his head, and spoke words I will never forget. Some women turn out great. Others just waste space. It didn't sting this time, not like it used to, because the part of me that had once believed his voice was louder than mine no longer existed. The laughter that followed was soft, almost unsure, but it was enough. It showed me everything I needed to know. I placed my fork down gently, not rushed, not angry, just certain. My hands were steady, and when I spoke, my voice was calm, like someone who had already walked through the storm and found the other side. I looked at him, and I said, "Good thing I just got my own place, 2,000 miles away. Don't worry, you'll never see me." The room froze in an instant. The laughter died in their throats, replaced by a silence so sharp it almost rang in my ears. Every pair of eyes turned to me, but for the first time in years, I didn't care what they thought. I didn't care if they were shocked, confused, or scared to speak. I had already left. My body was still sitting at that table, but my heart was already gone. He tried to laugh again, like it was just a joke, like my words couldn't possibly be real. But I didn't flinch, and I didn't smile. I simply let the truth hang in the air, heavier than anything he had ever thrown at me. In that moment, the power he had held over me slipped away, not because he gave it up, but because I took it back. There was no shouting, no begging, no breaking plates, just the sound of my voice cutting through the room like a door closing softly behind me. I stood up, slow and calm, and for the first time in my life, I walked away from that table, knowing I didn't owe anyone an explanation. The night air wrapped around me the moment I stepped out of that house, cool and quiet, nothing like the heavy room I had just left behind. I didn't rush to the car, I didn't look over my shoulder, and I didn't listen for his voice because I didn't need to anymore. Everything I needed had already been decided long before that night, and every step I took down that walkway felt like the weight of years slipping off my shoulders. For so long, I had imagined what leaving might feel like, but the truth was softer than I expected, almost peaceful, like the world had been waiting for me to finally choose myself. I could hear my own footsteps on the pavement, steady and clear, and for the first time, in what felt like forever, those steps belonged only to me. The car was packed with the things I had carefully gathered in silence. There were no rushed bags, no tears, no chaos, just the quiet strength of a woman who had finally accepted she didn't have to explain her worth to anyone. I opened the door, sat down, and rested my hands on the steering wheel for a long moment. My heart wasn't pounding in fear, it was beating in something steadier, something stronger. It was the sound of freedom taking its place where fear used to live. The house behind me stayed still. No one ran after me, no one called my name, and strangely, that didn't hurt at all. It confirmed what I had known for a long time. I had been invisible to them long before I decided to leave. I started the engine, and the soft hum of it felt like a promise. The road stretched out in front of me, and though it was dark, it felt wide and open in a way it never had before. I didn't think about what I was leaving behind. I thought about where I was going. That small mountain cottage, tucked away far from everything that had dimmed my light, waited for me like it had always known this day would come. I drove through the night without music, without talking, just breathing, letting the quiet guide me forward. Every mile between me and that house was a piece of myself returning. I didn't cry, I didn't shake. I just drove, steady, strong, certain. I wasn't escaping anything. I was going home to myself. When I finally pulled up to that little cottage tucked between the trees, the world felt like it had exhaled with me. It was still dark, just a few hours before sunrise, the kind of quiet that doesn't ask you questions or demand that you explain where you've been. The porch creaked beneath my feet as I stepped out of the car, and for a moment I just stood there, breathing in the air that carried no memory of his voice, no sound of anyone trying to make me small. The key was cold in my hand, but when I turned it in the lock and pushed that old wooden door open, it was like stepping into a part of myself I had left behind long ago. The cottage was simple, but it was mine. Not borrowed, not shared, not overshadowed. Mine. I walked through the rooms slowly, letting my fingers trace the edges of the furniture, the old stone walls, the worn wood under my feet. It smelled like cedar and rain, like a place that had been waiting patiently. It didn't matter that the furniture was dusty or that the floors needed sweeping. It felt honest, untouched by the weight of his presence, untouched by the silence that had followed me for years. I set my bags down by the doorway and closed the door behind me, and that sound, that quiet click of the lock, felt like a chapter sealing itself shut. I didn't tremble. I didn't second-guess myself. I simply stood there, breathing, feeling what it meant to be free. When the sun began to rise, soft light spilled through the small windows, painting everything in gold. I made a cup of coffee, sat in the old chair by the window, and listened to the wind move through the trees. There was no shouting, no laughter meant to hurt, no weight pressing on my chest. Just quiet. Just peace. I looked at the packed bags by the door, and for the first time they didn't feel like luggage. They felt like a new beginning folded neatly, waiting to be unpacked. I thought about all the years I had given to someone who never once asked what I needed, and how it took leaving everything behind to finally hear my own voice again. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel scared. I felt steady. Like this place, this quiet, was where I had belonged all along. And in that soft light, with the warmth of the cup between my hands, I realized I wasn't just starting over. I was finally living as if I mattered. It didn't take long before the silence I had found began to make noise in the world I'd left behind. The calls started first, not gentle, not warm, but filled with the kind of disbelief that comes from someone who never imagined I'd actually walk away. His voice on the phone sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it, but it still carried that same edge of control, like he believed if he just spoke long enough, I'd fold like I always did. He asked where I was, tried to remind me of everything we had built together, not with tenderness, but with the weight of someone who thought I belonged to the life he created. I let him speak, but I didn't give him what he was used to. I didn't explain myself. I didn't justify a single breath. When he ran out of words, all that was left on the line was his silence, the kind that comes when someone realizes their grip has finally slipped. The next calls came from the children, voices laced with shock and worry, but not the kind that comes from love. It was the kind that comes from convenience being disrupted. They asked questions as if I owed them an explanation for reclaiming my own life. Where did I go? Why didn't I say anything? What about the holidays? What about the house? Their words circled around everything that made their lives comfortable, not once around what had made mine heavy. For years, I had stood quietly in the background of their lives, always showing up, always holding things together. It was almost funny how they didn't see the storm that had been growing inside me, even when I'd been standing in it for so long. I didn't argue with any of them. I didn't fight, didn't raise my voice, didn't let them twist the story into something it wasn't. I spoke with a calm they didn't recognize. I told them I was safe. I told them I was where I wanted to be. And that was enough. Their questions kept coming, but I had no interest in being pulled back into a world where my worth had to be explained to be respected. I ended those calls the same way I had ended that dinner, quietly, firmly, without apology. And when the line went silent, the world around me didn't collapse. It stayed warm, still, and mine. That was the moment I realized that I didn't need their understanding to keep breathing. I didn't need their approval to build something new. Their confusion was their own storm to hold, not mine. For the first time in my life, their voices didn't dictate my next step. My peace did. And that peace was louder than any of their calls. Sitting in that small cottage with the soft wind brushing against the windows, I started to hear my own thoughts in a way I hadn't in years. There was no one talking over me. No footsteps filling the house, no weight pressing me into silence. It was just me, breathing, existing, feeling the space I had finally claimed. For so long I believed that love meant staying, that silence meant strength, that carrying everything without complaint made me good. But it doesn't make you good to stay where you're not respected. It just makes you smaller until you can barely recognize yourself. I had spent years shrinking to fit into a life that was never made to hold all of me, and for the first time I realized I didn't need to ask for permission to be whole. I thought about how many nights I had stood in the kitchen with my hands in the sink, letting the water run while pretending not to hear the laughter that made me disappear a little more each time. I thought about all the quiet sacrifices I had made just to keep the peace, even when that peace only ever existed for everyone but me. Those memories didn't make me cry, not this time. They made me stronger because now I could see them for what they really were. Pieces of a life that had shaped me but didn't define me. I had carried so much pain quietly that I forgot what it felt like to carry anything else. Now I carried myself, and that was enough. Every morning, I woke up before the sun and stood by the window with a cup of coffee warming my hands. I'd listen to the trees sway, the birds start their day, and it felt like the world was slowly reminding me that I was still here, that I had always been here, even when no one had truly seen me. My worth was never in the way they treated me. It had always been mine. They just tried to make me forget, and for a while they succeeded, but not anymore. That silence, the same silence that once felt like a prison, had turned into something else. It was no longer a cage, it was a home. A place where my voice could exist without needing to be small to be heard. And in that stillness, I understood something I had buried for too long. I was never wasting space. I was simply standing in the wrong place. And now, I was exactly where I belonged. With time, I came to understand that walking away wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a new one that belonged only to me. I stopped measuring my worth by how others treated me and started seeing it in the quiet strength that carried me through years of being unseen. I no longer needed the approval of people who were comfortable watching me disappear, and I didn't carry anger with me either. I carried peace, and that was enough. Some nights, I sit on the small porch with the stars stretching wide above me, and I think about the woman who once sat at a table swallowing her voice. She's gone now, and in her place stands someone who finally knows she matters. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end of my story. It truly means more than I can say. If this touched something in your heart, don't forget to leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe so you never miss another story.